Well, welcome everybody to a new term with the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Platonism, and it's a particular delight to have John Thompson, who wrote his doctoral thesis with the late and much lamented Maria Rosa Antonazza, and the topic of his thesis at King's London was the metaphysics of resurrection in the 17th century. Afterwards, he came to Cambridge and was working with the von Hugel Institute and has developed this, what was effectively a historical thesis, a thesis in the history of philosophy, into a more contemporary and systematic inquiry into the metaphysics of resurrection, full stop. So, John, we're very excited to hear your presentation this evening.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you very much. It's a delight to be back at the center. It's a source of great intellectual and personal joy, both during my doctorate and during the years I was here at Cambridge. So thank you, Douglas, for having me back. But some will say, how are the dead raised, and with what body do they come? So St. Paul records the ancient objection to Christian metaphysics and religion in his first letter to the Corinthians, and this will be the subject of my talk this evening. I'd like to begin our discussion by commenting on the epigraphs. I hope you have a handout at the beginning of your handout, as I think they provide a glimpse into the argument I'll be making. So the first quotation is by Empedocles, and it's admittedly an enigmatic quotation, but in my view, it bears forth a profound philosophical insight in poetic form. He writes, "For from what is not at all, it is impossible that something come about, and that what is be completely destroyed is unfeasible and unheard of." What is the meaning of this Empedoclean impulse? One way to read Empedocles is as articulating a metaphysical principle that is actually fairly well attested through Plato, Aristotle, and until Leibniz at least. The first half of the quotation suggests that there must be some eternal being behind all beings as the source of their possibility. But the second half is what is most important for our purposes. And the thought seems to be this: if something should exist, then it cannot be reduced to absolute non-being. As Empedocles says, be completely destroyed or even utterly destroyed, you might translate it. After all, if a being should actually exist, then it has shown itself to be a logically and metaphysically coherent entity. We might say actuality entails possibility. So even if such a being should cease to actually exist, it cannot be utterly destroyed. That is, it cannot be reduced to metaphysical impossibility or total incoherence. It can only presumably be reduced again to a possible but still metaphysically coherent being. Note here an implicit connection, that being and intelligibility on the Empedoclean impulse are tied together. And I think this is true from Empedocles to Plato to Leibniz, and I would say this is one of the insights about metaphysics at the center when I was here. Douglas especially impressed upon me, this connection, tight connection between being and intelligibility. So the significance of this Empedoclean impulse to the metaphysics of resurrection will be made clear in a moment. The quotation from Thomas Aquinas is from his Quodlibet Questions. So he writes this: "Ideo potest eadem numero reparare, etiamsi in nihilum elapsa fuerit." God could bring entities back numerically the same, even if they fell into nothingness. The context for this proposition is the question, quote, "If something were reduced to nothing, could God restore it the same in number?" End quote. And it's clear that the most salient application of this question for Aquinas and for his audience is to the possibility of the resurrection of the body. For the questioner is asking, what if, for the sake of argument, the human person should go completely out of existence at death? What is a seemingly abstruse metaphysical question is actually deeply existentially freighted. And I think one interesting historical note is that Aquinas would have had this extemporaneous question leveled at him either in the period of Advent or in the period of Lent, periods of fasting in the church calendar. So I find this a striking feature of the culture of medieval scholastic universities, that periods of fasting and spiritual reflection might correspond to periods of what you might call intellectual soul searching. Exercises during these times were not dogmatic exposition primarily, but consideration of the most pressing puzzles in Christian theology. And I think this undercuts somewhat our picture of scholasticism as a dry and purely objective theological method. Okay, so putting aside these features of the context of this quodlibetal question from Aquinas, his response is what really matters for our purposes. Aquinas is clear elsewhere that he believes in an immaterial intellect, and therefore he believes that the soul can and does persist after death. But he argues here that even if that should not occur, God could raise numerically the same human being. God could even, Aquinas suggests, return the same substantial form of the same intellect into being if it should be destroyed. Now, why does Aquinas hold this? His argument is relatively straightforward. God's power extends to all logically and metaphysically possible entities or states of affairs. We can call this the Thomistic impulse, to stand alongside the Empedoclean impulse. And if there is no proof that a human being ceasing to exist causes its future existence to be an absolutely impossible state of affairs, God can bring back the human being numerically the same. I will return to various recent objections to this position in a moment, but Aquinas' approach is one with which I am deeply sympathetic. Regarding a doctrine like the resurrection of the flesh, I would commend two features of the Thomistic impulse. First, that he emphasizes omnipotence as a framing consideration. Second, Aquinas suggests a strategy of defense regarding a mystery like the resurrection of the body. And this strategy of defense enjoys fairly widespread support in the history of philosophy. And I have one example on your handout of a Cambridge philosopher from the early modern period who holds to this view, Nathaniel Culverwell. He writes, divine mysteries were never against reason, they were always above reason. And it will be employment enough for reason to redeem and vindicate them from those thorns and difficulties which some subtle ones have vexed them and encompassed them, end quote. And this kind of strategy of defense is present in other great figures in the history of philosophy as well. It's there in Leibniz, especially. So in contrast to much recent analytic philosophy of religion, in which the attempt is made to demonstrate, we might say, the modus of resurrection by appeal to some favored theory of personal identity, Thomas and others seek to guard the mystery by providing a rational defense. That is, they do not tend to insist on their own favored theory of personal identity as the epistemic basis of assent to resurrection or the afterlife. So taken together, the Empedoclean and Thomistic impulses suggest that even before we discuss the metaphysical details of how God might return the dead to life, there is a credible reason to think he could do so. But of course, the job of the philosopher of religion is in part to apply reason to even revealed mysteries like resurrection by answering objections to their coherence. And there are certainly no shortage of metaphysical objections to resurrection by recreation. So I will turn now to several of those objections. I will then suggest in part 3 some positive models of the metaphysics of resurrection in hopes of showing that even if we don't claim to know with certainty the modality of the resurrection of the body, one need not be a metaphysical quietist in appealing to omnipotence in the way that I am. So section 2, Objections to resurrection by recreation. One of the most intuitive objections to the notion of resurrection is the following. To recreate a particular human being, God would need to reproduce a person across a temporal gap. But human beings are not the sort of things that can retain identity across temporal gaps. So even God cannot achieve this miracle. This general argument is subject to the response. What is it about gappy existence that so subverts identity? We will need more detail to judge whether gappy existence places a limit on omnipotence. And more detail is provided by several philosophers. These include, one of the first places I found this precise argument is the medieval theologian Durandus of Saint-Pourçain, who's a Thomist. But John Locke and several recent commentators make similar arguments. So these thinkers suggest that resurrection by recreation is impossible because human beings are individuated by their beginning of existence or by their spatio-temporal origins. That is, human beings are individuals, the individuals they are distinct from all others of their kind in virtue of their coming into actuality at a place and time distinct from all others. You can see how this works. You are the individual you are precisely in virtue of having come to be in the place you came to be. And so there's a continuous history back to that beginning point, and that beginning point, that beginning of existence is what makes you the individual you are. Accordingly, argue these philosophers, for God to recreate a candidate resurrected person would be for God to produce a new set of spatio-temporal origins. But that would, ipso facto, create a unique, numerically distinct person, not the one that went out of existence. In a recent version of this argument, Adam Wood puts the objection to recreation in terms of the categories of substantial form and matter. You have this quotation on your handout. So he says, if a given substantial form informs matter under some particular spatio-temporal dimensions, it is necessarily numerically distinct from any substantial form coming into matter at a different place or time. Hence, the substances resulting from uniting form and matter at two different times or places are also necessarily numerically distinct. And John Locke, in the essay concerning human understanding, puts a similar argument forward that beginning to exist in a particular time and place is what individuates. And so you cannot have gaps in the life of what he calls men. He means human beings. We can formulate this argument in the following way, and this is on your handout. Individuation, first of all, is a function of spatio-temporal origins. Second, an individual human being can have only one set of spatio-temporal starting points. Third, a recreated human being has two distinct sets of temporal starting points. Consequently, a recreated person is necessarily distinct from all past persons. So let's grant the theory of individuation claimed here. Premises 1 and 2 we can admit for the sake of argument. It's premise 3 that is most questionable. And when we focus on this claim, we see that the argument fails in that even a substance individuated by matter can have a unique first beginning of existence and a resumption of existence that is spatio-temporally distinct. The key is how one describes the case, right? So if you say one entity has two beginnings of existence, that does imply a contradiction with this theory of individuation. But why are we describing the second as a first beginning of existence at all? So one is not logically or metaphysically obliged to describe the second creation, as it were, as contradicting the proposition that the substance began to exist at time 1 and place 1. So to insist that the recreation is a distinct spatio-temporal origin or a distinct first creation is to beg the crucial question, namely whether we have the same substance reappearing. So I could say a little bit about why I think Wood's argument goes wrong here. I will skip over that for now, and we'll move on to Peter Van Inwagen's objection to resurrection by recreation. This is section 2b. So a second argument against the possibility of gappy existence or the appeal to omnipotence and resurrection by recreation is this. Substances with a divided duration are essentially distinct. This is because it is of the essence of a human being to exist continuously, or to have contiguous temporal parts, philosophers might say today. Accordingly, a recreated human being, no matter how similar she is to the person that died, is numerically distinct from that past person. So the renowned metaphysician Peter Van Inwagen presents such a criticism of reassembly of the body or even recreation accounts of the possibility of resurrection in a 1978 paper. This is one of the most famous papers. So on these accounts, which Van Inwagen calls Aristotelian, God brings precisely the same living human body back into existence after death. And perhaps on this view, the reassembly of the particles of the body is part of what constitutes the recreation, or perhaps, as some contemporary Thomists emphasize, the body is re-identified when the intellect informs some otherwise undifferentiated matter. In any case, say traditional defenders of resurrection, we cannot claim that such recreation is impossible. Van Inwagen responds by calling this so much whistle talk. He says that this defense is totally insufficient. So he employs a thought experiment about a manuscript of Augustine, which is burned in AD 456 and purportedly recreated by God in AD 458. And Van Inwagen claims that the manuscript must be a mere replica, even if God uses, as it were, the same particles. Why is this the case? Well, because the manuscript, he says, would never have known the impress of Augustine's hand. Quote, it would not have been part of the furniture of the world when he was alive, end quote. The same is meant to apply to the idea of putative resurrection by either reassembly or recreation. Now, again, I would say such a description arguably begs the question against those who defend the veracity of the manuscript and the possibility of resurrection. If identity even may obtain between the pre-fire and post-fire manuscripts, then it is not obviously true that the post-miracle manuscript does not bear the marks of Augustine's hand. Again, to describe it that way begs crucial questions. But Van Inwagen provides a positive argument against the possibility of identity at resurrection by recreation. In the case of the manuscript, identity does not hold because, quote, the various atoms that compose the tracings of ink on its surface occupy their present position, not as a result of Augustine's activity, but of God's, end quote. So the thought seems to be that there cannot possibly be identity because there is a causal break between the manuscript before the fire and after the miracle. The parallel to resurrection is clear. If there is a causal break between a particular human organism's earthly life and the life of an organism or a human being at resurrection, then the resurrected person cannot possibly be one and the same as the earthly person. It seems to me that most commentators have not noticed, however, that this criticism of resurrection by recreation by Van Inwagen is in deep tension with his own positive view of resurrection. Some of you might be familiar with this, this account. So on Van Inwagen's famous story, defending the possibility of resurrection, he claims that it's possible that at the moment of death, God removes one's actual body and replaces it with an exact replica. It's the replica that goes down into the tomb. We're all unaware of God doing this, of course, but right at just the correct moment, God takes away our actual bodies and replaces them with bodies that go down into the grave. And God stores these bodies somewhere, we don't know where, and presumably in another dimension or something like this. But importantly, the body that is stored away does not reach the stage of biological death and corruption from which revivification is impossible. So through God's miracle of relocation, the human organism retains its integrity and dispositions, enough that it can live again at the last day. Presumably, the human being is upheld either in stasis by God between death and resurrection, or the organism is placed in an environment, some kind of cosmic deep freezer, I guess, where such stasis can be maintained indefinitely. So Van Wagen here is committed to this just so story because of his physicalism about human persons. So he thinks we have to have some criterion that appeals to no gappy existence and that is fully compatible with physicalism. And Van Wagen's defense of the possibility of resurrection is always the most colorful part of a talk on resurrection. Now, there are two considerations, I think, telling against Van Wagen's approach. The first is, as I mentioned, it's in tension. His criticism of resurrection by recreation is in tension with his own story. And this is because in each case, I would argue, it is only the direct action of God which makes it the case that the parts of the body occupy just the places they do at resurrection. So in the case of the Augustinian manuscript, the particles of the manuscript are there because of reassembly. But in Van Wagen's own account, the parts of the body, when they're whisked away, do not possess sufficient immanent causal powers to maintain their integrity after death. God has to uphold them. So in the period between death and resurrection, it is only God's direct action that causes identity to obtain. So the second reply, though, I think is more positive and more productive. It's not at all clear that continuous duration is an essential feature of human beings. This is because we may reasonably take human beings to be what some philosophers have called permanent entities, entities which exist tota simul or all at once. That is, in a permanent entity, the entire essence of the being is present at every moment at which it exists. So every metaphysically necessary part of a permanent being is present at every moment at which it exists. Successive entities, by contrast, are entities that don't have every essential part present at each moment they exist. So what is this distinction coming to? Well, successive entities exist merely as temporal part next to temporal part next to temporal part. So the kind of paradigm, excuse me, the paradigm case for a successive entity would be an arrow flying through the air, or rather the motion of the arrow. So if you have a motion, if you consider a motion, it's a successive entity because it is what it is. Its essence is contained in the fact that it has contiguous temporal parts. If you had an arrow that were flying through the air and it stopped in midair and then moved again, that would not be one motion. That would be two motions, right? So contiguity of temporal parts, that is continuity of duration, is the definition or is definitionally true of successive entities, but not of permanent entities. But if human beings are permanent entities, there is little reason to think that continuous duration is an essential feature of us. We're not like motions. We are substances of some kind, you might think. Unlike the motion of an arrow, it's not at all clear that contiguous temporal parts are essential to me. As philosopher Turner Nevitt writes, my unity does not essentially contain continuity of duration. If it did, then you could not have the whole of me in a momentary time slice. Do you see how this works? If I have an essence that is fully contained in any one time slice, then I must be a permanent being. I can't be a successive entity or successive being. But you do have the whole of me at some time slice. Therefore, we must be permanent entities. And if continuous duration is not essential to me, then it's prima facie metaphysically possible that I should be resurrected by a divine act of recreation. And admittedly, while there may be no rationally coercive argument for a substantialist metaphysics like this one that says we are permanent entities, There is neither a coercive argument against it, I would say. So 2C. One more argument against possibility of resurrection by recreation from Eric Olson, the metaphysician of personal identity. He writes, and this is on your handout, there could be someone like you in the next world, just like you, both physically and mentally. But if you have died and only dust remains, it is impossible for that person to be you. It could only be a replica, presumably a completely new being who never lived in this world. Now, I'm not sure how Olson provides a sufficient argument for this quite strong metaphysical principle. True, it may not be evident how there is personal identity across death, but that is not the same as demonstrating that it's impossible. This is the Thomistic impulse that I mentioned earlier. One version of Olson's argument, which we can marshal, however, would be called the argument from instantiability, or the objection from instantiability, and it would run like this. A human person is essentially individual, but as the metaphysician of individuation J.J. Gracia points out, individuals are defined by their non-instantiability. That is, an individual cannot be instantiated multiply in discrete portions of matter or places at the same time. And this is what distinguishes individuals, says Gracia, from universals. So individuals, each of you is an individual, so you're non-instantiable. There can't be multiple of you in discrete places. But universals, like human nature, is instantiable. Each of you is an instance. Therefore, a positive account, we might say, of the possibility of personal identity between a person now and some person at resurrection must include an account of personal identity that rules out instantiability. However, and this is picking up Olson, when one imagines a resurrected version of herself, she is merely imagining a formally identical version of herself. Nothing in the imagining or conceiving of a formal replica at some point in the future rules out instantiability. But we're all individuals. If persons are individuals, which we want to think we are, then we have to rule out instantiability. And you can ask what features, whatever features you imagine in a replica version of yourself are, it seems, instantiable in 100 others, right? God could create 100 worlds just like this one, where you're resurrected. You, a formal replica of you, is resurrected in each of them. So a person cannot be said to be imagining a future person identical to herself to the extent that there is a discernible trace, or only to the extent that there's a discernible trace or principle of her individuality in the imagining. So the resurrected person is a mere replica. So I suggest two responses to Olson's line of reasoning here. First, there are some imaginable candidates for ruling out instantiability and grounding personal identity at resurrection. I'll set out some of those below, but just to gesture, they include identity of soul and identity of body. Second, I would say I'd like to present a final general argument in favor of the possibility of gappy existence. And this originates from the Empedoclean impulse I talked about at the beginning. It seems correct to say that any act of corruption, destruction, or annihilation merely returns an actual being from actual existence to possible existence. So destruction itself does not, without any further argument, cause a formerly actual being to be necessarily non-existent. So when it goes out of existence, what makes it necessarily non-existent? A piece of supporting evidence for this claim might come from Kant's famous response to the ontological argument. When we imagine a possible being, we are imagining it as existing. The actualization of some entity does not add a property to that thing. But one might reasonably surmise that the converse is true. If we consider or imagine an actual being that has been destroyed, we are imagining one and the same entity as formerly existed. which is one and the same entity we imagined as actual before it was actual. In short, destruction cannot make a being less than it was before it actually existed, namely, possibly existent. So one might here want to say, though, that we shouldn't talk about possible things or possible states of affairs as beings at all. I don't think you have to be committed to possibly existent things being entities. To get this point, though, we could say something like, we could substitute for non-actualized being something like a complete description of some kind, a complete concept of a thing, right? We need a good argument for the claim that existence, again, is logically or metaphysically impossible, that somehow a being that's gone out of existence has gained this property, as it were, of being absolutely non-existent, of being not possibly actually existent. As Empedocles insists, whoever heard of what is being utterly destroyed? Section 3. Some may worry at this juncture that this defensive strategy, this falling back on omnipotence, as I've done, leads us to metaphysical quietism. Can't we say anything positive about the principle of personal identity? And I'm not advocating quietism. Although I do not think they are absolutely necessary for defending the reasonableness of belief in the possibility of resurrection. I think there are promising models, metaphysical models, that are good candidates for the actual principles of human identity, some of which are perfectly compatible with resurrection. So I'll take two. First, Swinburne's dualism, his substance dualism. So Richard Swinburne has famously argued that substance dualism provides the most plausible answer to perennial questions in the philosophy of personal identity. Concretely, he suggests that appeals to an immaterial substance would explain personal identity in the face of challenges like Bernard Williams' duplication problem. So there are so many thought experiments. The literature is littered with them. But Williams in the 1950s is pursuing a materialist metaphysics of personal identity, and he rediscovers, as it were, this problem. Well, what if you appeal to the identity of the brain, or the identity of the brain plus continuity of memory as your principle of personal identity? You can come up with all kinds of wacky counterexamples. For instance, we know that you can retain some level of psychological continuity in a commissurotomy when your brain is divided. And so there's this thought experiment that what if my body went on living, but my brain was removed, and each hemisphere, after it was divided, was placed into two living human bodies, and a new brain was put in my living body. I was kept alive the whole time. So you have in this body continuity of the organism. You have in two other bodies candidates for continuity, psychological continuity, right? So what is the materialist to do here? His intuitions point in all sorts of different directions. And Swinburne, for his purposes, says, I have a solution. There is an immaterial substance, and wherever the immaterial substance is, there is personal identity. So the mental life of the person is included in the immaterial or non-material substance. And so this, Swinburne thinks this explains the metaphysics of personal identity better than materialism. And he writes, the soul is the essential part of the person, and it is its continuing which constitutes the continuum of the person. So take that for what you will as an answer to the problem. The point, though, is you may think immaterial substances, that's a non-option, that's fine. But the point is that if this is a candidate account of personal identity, if it's even plausible, then we have an answer to Olson's objection. We have an answer to the question of instantiability because immaterial substances are not multiply instantiable. They're not universals, they're individuals. And it could be the principle of continuity. I must say, however, that it strikes me as deeply unintuitive that I am identical with my soul rather than the composite that is my mind or soul and body. But the main concern I would register with Swinburne's view is that it may not be compatible with one or more central theological desiderata. Most importantly, Swinburne's view entails that because personal identity resides in the soul alone as a complete substance, one need not, strictly speaking, take up one's earthly body again at resurrection. You can have personal identity without resurrection. The historic creeds of the church, by contrast, and I would say kind of historic philosophical and theological reflection, by contrast, emphasizes the centrality of bodily resurrection for personal identity. And while Swinburne's view is not incompatible with such an emphasis, it is certainly not consonant with it, this idea that the person is completely contained in the soul. After all, how does one explain bodily resurrection in the creeds and elsewhere if the immaterial soul is only accidentally related to the bodies we carry about with us? So finally, ecumenical hylomorphism. This is another approach, another model for personal identity. And this would be, I think, a model that I'm working on. It's essentially this view that the human person is a composite of mind and body. Secondly, that personal identity requires sameness of mind or soul and body. And third, that as an essentially embodied creature, the human being requires embodiment on first creation. So you can see some of the distinctions between this view and Swinburne's. Note here that this model is hylomorphic from the Greek for matter and form because it insists on two metaphysical principles together, or two metaphysical parts together constituting a single human being or person. As Aristotle describes this relationship, the matter of the body flows through the form or the soul or the mind that unifies it. And Mark Cohen summarizes the way in which matter and form work together for Aristotle or for hylomorphists more generally. This is on your handout. In tracing the career of a persisting individual through time, we may indeed follow the form rather than the matter which, in Aristotle's vivid metaphor, flows through it. That is, you trace the form when you're following John around with your eyes. You don't trace the constituent matter because the matter, everyone's known since before Aristotle, the matter does not remain the same. But to follow the form at all is to follow it in a persisting material individual, whose persistence as an individual may still be due to the spatiotemporal continuity of its component matter. It thus appears that a principle of diachronic identity satisfactory to Aristotle is not likely to omit reference to material continuity. What does this mean? Well, it means that these two principles are individually necessary and jointly sufficient, you might think, for personal identity, an immaterial aspect and a material aspect, continuity of the material aspect. And this, it seems to me, is a reasonable approach to the metaphysics of personal identity. Since human persons are essentially embodied creatures, material continuity is part of our identity. Even Descartes toyed with this idea that he's more closely connected to this body than to the matter of the rest of the world. So the model is ecumenical because although it insists on two such elements, it does not insist on a particular philosophy of mind or construal of the causal relationships between them. So this model is, as far as I can tell, compatible with the views of the following thinkers on resurrection. This is one of the virtues of the view: Athenagoras, the church father Augustine, Gregory of Nyssa, Thomas Aquinas, surprisingly Martin Luther and Melanchthon, who at least for periods were moralist about the soul. It's compatible with their views, I think. John Calvin, Peter Martyr Vermigli, perhaps our dear Cambridge Platonists, and quite possibly even something like contemporary view, William Hasker's emergent dualism. That is the view that the mind is an emergent property or set of properties, deeply connected to the body. There are minds, but they are emergent from brains. So what might a model say about the metaphysics of resurrection? I think the model requires material continuity between the paramortem and resurrection body, and sameness of the immaterial aspect of the human person's mind or the soul or whatever. So we see this model expressed well by the 17th century Oxford Thomist Richard Gardner. He writes, "If our particular bodies shall not rise again, then we, our own particular selves, shall never be revived. For the individuating or making man to be numerically one and the same depends as well from the identity or oneness of the body as to the soul," end quote. So this admittedly raises a very old and again quite comical problem, the problem of shared matter. This occurs from the patristics all the way up to current discussions. So if material continuity really is part of the metaphysics of personal identity, as Aristotle seemed to think, and as many others in the tradition suggest, then there must be the possibility of shared matter between distinct persons at the times of their death. Think of the problem of cannibalism, right? In the crassest form. How can the victims of cannibalism be raised? If there is the possibility of shared matter, then even God cannot raise both persons with their individual bodies, and therefore personal identity is undermined. I don't think this objection stands as a proof of the metaphysical impossibility of resurrection, even on this model, this Heidelberg model. And the response is given by the philosopher of science, Del Rash. He says, it could be that God carries out the general resurrection through an extended period of time, so that he raises one person first and miraculously causes the matter of the body, as it were, to flow through and be replenished in that resurrected body. So you might think God does it rather quickly through causing the body to emit light, as is sometimes considered part of the resurrection life. So then God appropriates that matter to the body of the distinct person who shared matter at the time of their respective deaths for a second resurrection. Quite a conceit, no doubt, but I think a successful defense against the charge that metaphysical impossibility is involved. Again, that's the burden that needs to be met. Is metaphysical impossibility proved? I think not. Importantly, and this is my final point, the hylomorphic model suggests that the two principles of mind and matter, while forming a unity, are distinct entities. Although they're not distinct substances in my view, they're distinct entities. They have some entity of their own. A particular human mind, having come to exist, has particularity. This seems self-evident to us, whether we're more dualistic or we're emergent dualists. We think it's a set of properties. It's still not reducible to physical. The matter of the body also has particularity. Accordingly, even if the matter of the body should be dispersed or go out of existence, or if the soul or mind should cease to exist at death, this in itself presents no indefeasible argument against the possibility of resurrection. Put otherwise, the Empedoclean and Thomistic impulses, if they are correct, then omnipotence seems to me sufficient to answer objections to personal identity at resurrection. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for this extremely lucid and intriguing discussion of the whole question of the resurrection of the body. What would you say to someone who raised the notion of the spiritual body? Because one of the things I was wondering while you were talking about matter and mind, or hylomorphism, so the shape and the stuff, as from the houlet, is, well, what according to the latest science is matter. And, Russell quipped, matter has become spooky as anything in the most bizarre seances. I just wonder what your thoughts are about yes, this notion of the spiritual body.
Yeah, so maybe I can take those in turn, that the idea of the spiritual body, and then say a little bit about matter, although I don't know how much I could say. So the spiritual body, so there are, of course, different ways of reading that famous passage in St. Paul. It's later on from the passage I quoted at the beginning. So he says a body is as it were planted or buried. An earthly body, it's raised a spiritual body. The Greek term there is somatikon, so spiritish body, something like that. But the fascinating phrase is the earthly body phrase, which is it's buried a soulish body. And so this is hard to translate. Soma psychikon, right? It's very difficult to translate. And so we get the contrast all mixed up in translations. It's called natural sometimes, it's sometimes called physical body going down to the ground, and the spiritual body coming out. So is it non-material? Well, I would say the contrast is not between materiality and immateriality, full stop, because these bodies, Paul seems to be suggesting, are soulish bodies that we carry around. So there will be an end to soulish bodies. But what is the spiritual body? I think I would say two things. One, St. Augustine reads this contrast, and I think helpfully reads this contrast as, so some background. I mean, Aristotle talks about psychikai as or soulish as an adjective, as the highest capacities that make human beings distinctively human. So it's not an emphasis. Psychikai doesn't mean physicality. Earthly body doesn't mean physicality. When Augustine addresses this, he thinks the contrast is between humanly oriented bodies and spirit oriented bodies. So the transformation is primarily one of disposition and moral and spiritual capacities rather than substance. That's the way Augustine reads the passage. So spiritual body as well is read in the tradition often as a transformed body. So the medievals talk a lot about luminescence as a quality of this body and all these fascinating features. So they read it as one and the same entity, one and the same being, still a human being, but with qualities that are radically transformed. Now, of course, there's another tradition, and maybe this is what you're pointing to. There's another tradition in Western philosophy, going back to Origen, which says spiritual body is a transformation of kind, that it won't be a recognizably human body, the spiritual body. So that is there, it should be said. And there are interesting arguments back and forth between those two.
And if I may, just before I go to the floor, and it's interesting that Olson is actually a student of Berlin.
Oh, okay.
So in a way, I mean, Olson's position is clear because he's an animalist, right?
Mm-hmm.
So his view about personal identity is, well, we're just animals.
That's right. That's right.
We have a biological beginning and a biological end, just like any other organism. So for Olson, the issue is just straightforward. What's more mysterious is the Inwagian version of theistic materialism.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that Olson should be, in a way, is a sort of naughty pupil of Ingvarden, but in a way, a very consistent one. But I'm sure there's lots of questions. Christoph?
I'm sorry if this is really elementary, but I'm just kind of curious, to develop this hylomorphic view, like, how do you establish, do you make it so that the body is necessary in any way? Because I'm just wondering how you respond to things like the Kafka case, like, somebody wakes up in the body of a cockroach, but they have the same identity because their mind's the same, so forth. So what is, like, a way in which we could not conceive of the identity of the person without the body being part of it?
Yeah, that's great. So I think some views would hold that the Kafka case is just a metaphysical impossibility. I think we need to develop an argument for that, I guess. I think the ecumenical hylomorphism that I would hold to would be to say, I'm not claiming that the mind is inseparable from the human body. I'm just saying that personal identity, it seems to me, what it means to be a person is to be this composite. So we can talk about persons full stop being separated from their bodies when their minds are separated from their bodies, but that's a way of speaking. I don't think we have to commit ourselves to saying that's a full person. And so the separability of mind from body is compatible with this hylomorphism I hold to. I would say, why reject the view that the separate mind is a full person, that it retains personal identity completely? I think you could do two things. One, you could make a philosophical argument that we're tricking ourselves when we imagine these cases, that it doesn't, like, we haven't actually conceived it, or that thinking we conceive it doesn't entail its possibility. And therefore, even though we're identical with our minds, they're not separable from our bodies. That would be a philosophical approach. Or this would be my approach, would be to say, well, I can conceive, I can't give an argument that it's metaphysically impossible that the mind should be separate. And I actually think the mind is potentially separable, at least by miracle. But that there are certain theological considerations that mean that I don't attribute to that human personhood, personal identity in the full sense. It's a part of a person, not a human person that's present there.
Good.
Just a bit of a follow-up to that, really, and some of the comments you made there. I'm curious, turning away from humans, what account you would give of angels, because presumably they are persons or person-like, and indeed God. Obviously, the focus of this has been human personal identity, but I'm curious what you think makes up a person in those cases. I'm assuming you hold that there are angels.
So I think one of the reasons I would attribute, and this is quite a traditional view, but one of the reasons I would attribute personhood to composites in the human case is that I would say humans are individuated by their coming to be, and that happens in part through embodiment. Whereas for angels, you have different views of angels, of course, but if you think they're immaterial, truly immaterial, nothing about their coming to be is tied to embodiment. So if we say they're persons, they could be immaterial substances and retain personal identity just in virtue of persisting as substances. So that would be one kind of approach you could take. But I do think, it's an intuition philosophically that humans are tied to embodiment. I think that's something that we might want to retain. It's maybe a principle of common sense that we might want to retain. It's defeasible, of course, but And then I think secondly, there are theological considerations that mean embodiment is tied to what it means to be a human person. And that would be a difference with angels.
We have two more questions, it's three, I think, but we also.
No, sorry.
You were, sorry, I misread you, sorry. Dr. Fakori, and then, yeah.
Thank you for your paper. I had two questions. Maybe start with this one, the Empedocles quotation that you have. If one reads it without the completely destroyed, if you just read, and that what is be destroyed is unfeasible and unheard of, that he seems to be making a case rather for permanence, or for just the permanence of being. Perhaps that could be said for the eternity of being. But what with the completely, that leaves the room for something can be perhaps partially or either partially destroyed or destroyed for a certain period of time, and then you're. Wouldn't you say though that on Empedocles' own, if you take his whole philosophy as a whole,
Right.
he would be arguing for something more like a eternity and permanence of being rather than the resurrection.
Yeah.
You
Yeah. So I have to say it was slightly cheeky, including this in the sense that I don't think the way I interpret it is at the core of Empedocles' concerns. I mean, I don't know Empedocles well enough, but my sense is that there is. I mean, I'd love to hear your views on it if you have views on his metaphysics. I mean, my sense is there is some metaphysics of change in his view of nature, of perishing and returning in, or we might call it flux in at least parts of his corpus. So, I mean, I guess I would just lean into those and say, even though he thinks there's a kind of permanence, that permanence is not necessarily expressed in all kinds of beings at all times, even though it underlies all kinds of beings. So that's what I was leaning into in quoting him. But how do you read this quotation within his wider thought?
For me, it was just wondering whether the argument hinged on the completely in this way.
Yeah.
Or not. It was wondering. But do I have a thought?
Yes, of course.
Second had to do, and you partly addressed it in response to Ben's question. In the second response to Unembodied's objection, you say human persons may indeed exist as permanent entities rather than successive entities. And that got, in the response, you had that individuation and embodiment, but that wouldn't apply to angels, and in which case one can speak of them as permanent entities. But in the case of human beings, their individuation is tied to their embodiment. So how would one still speak of them as permanent entities?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think embodiment and change of body would be compatible with being a permanent entity. So permanent is slightly misleading in the sense that it doesn't mean that there are no changes in properties or something like that. It doesn't even mean that an entity is not liable to passivity in the way that human embodiment entails, where it just means that it's the kind of entity that whenever it exists in all its essential metaphysical parts. And so the way I would describe it in the human case would be, well, the essential metaphysical parts of a human person are this form and matter, this mind and matter, this immaterial aspect and this material aspect. And so embodiment, you could have different views on when a person actually begins, obviously, but the thought would be a human being is fully present whenever those two principles are there. And so at the moment of individuation, originating causality or whatever, whenever the form and matter come together, there is a person. And that person persists as long as those two principles are united. And that's because these are essential metaphysical parts. So the person doesn't have to be 6 feet tall to be that person, doesn't have to be old or young. Those are all accidental properties. They don't, the very idea of persisting through accidental properties, I would say, implies a permanent entity.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yes.
Yes.
So my question is kind of, I guess, like, how gappy of an existence are you defending? So I sort of, in my mind, I've categorized into like three grades of gappiness, right? So one grade of gappiness is like gappiness in respect of the body. So there's some part other than the body which persists, which sort of bridges that gap, and so no problem. I think most, like I would say no problem with that. The sort of grade above that is like, well, maybe there is a kind of total gap. So maybe that when you talked about like God alone, God's power alone being the source of the reconstitution of the human being, that would be a total gap. That would be an even more profound gap than the sort of just materially gappy one. And then I think in this case, I think even here, God is serving as a kind of like atemporal part, right? Which is still connecting the different temporal parts. So there is still a connection. It's just running through God.
Yeah.
And whereas like there's an even more profound degree of gappiness where there's neither temporal nor atemporal parts connecting them.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no like, when you talk of say the permanent entity, right? There's an atemporal part, in fact, it's something which doesn't undergo change in any respect, which connects all like temporal instances.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So I think the third kind would be a big problem, right? But that would be, so could God have gappy existence, right? So that's kind of the only scenario under which that third one would be realized, it seems to me.
Yeah. So the third one, actually, I was thinking like, if we say that so whether or not God serves as an atemporal part connecting gappy existence is somewhat an issue for me, because I think there's a risk if we treat God's power as an atemporal part specifically replicable to the creature, that you sort of collapse the creator-creature distinction.
Okay.
And that would be problematic, right? So
Yeah, I mean, so I would say the presence of so the whole framework here relies upon the notion that God is present to every possible entity in a timeless way. And I think that's a classical view of omnipotence. That's the view I hold. And so that would mean that that kind of shifts the burden in my thinking from the defender of the possibility of resurrection to those who would object to it, because we could be empiricists about objects and human beings. That's an option. I don't particularly like empiricism. I don't feel compelled to be an empiricist about persons. I think they're much more interesting than what can be disclosed through observation. But if you reject empiricism, or if you're not moved by it, then you can say that in principle, there are, because God is timelessly present to every possible entity, it may be beyond our ken how he would go about recreating such an entity, right? And so that's what I'm trying to push on. Now the kind of worry about the divide between creature and creator, I wouldn't say God is an atemporal part of any creature. I would say during periods of not actually existing, every creature with a coherent, what Leibniz would call a complete concept, like any creature that has possible existence is present to God, even if it doesn't actually exist.
Present to God, but not identical with God.
Oh, no, not a part of God, just
Yeah.
present to God relative to his power, right? And his knowledge,
Okay.
right?
Right.
And so they're like, on one view, God knows, with perfection, every possible world, that he hasn't actualized. But it's not as though, those are absolutely impossible or something like that. They have to be possible worlds. They're present to him eternally. But he doesn't have to create them to know them, to be present to them, I would say. Is that helpful? So he's still sovereign as creator, even though their being is present to him eternally.
So I guess my question would be like, in their presence to him in that eternal mode, yet not identity with him, does that effectively become like a variation on the soul idea? Like, so, I mean, there might be some differences, right? But it sort of plays essentially the same function. Like something proper to me continues to persist atemporally, even when my temporal bits are all sort of scattered all over the place. And it's not identical to God, it's present to him, in this sort of atemporal mode.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a soul because I think, like souls actually exist, right? Possible souls are present to God, but not actual, right? So, but I think the spirit of your question, even if the soul should go out of existence, actual existence, that immaterial part of me is still present to God as a possibility.
Kind of like the soul of the soul.
Yeah, God's idea of that soul.
Yeah.
Right? The complete concept of that soul is present to God, even if it doesn't actually exist. Even if he annihilates it, it's still present to him in the sense that if it's metaphysically coherent, it's a possible entity. It doesn't actually exist, but it could exist again if it's just been reduced to possibility.
Can I still ask? Yeah, maybe it's a basic question, but I was a bit, lost with the whole talk of actuality and possibility, because this trope of the Neoplatonism up until German idealism, etc., kind of works around those ideas, whether it's we've seen in Schelling or in Plotinus, etc. And I'm not entirely sure what's the metaphysical. What would we say metaphysically about possibility in this context? Yeah.
So what is possibility?
So does it actually is it an existence in itself, or is it something that will exist to exist, in the future, or in a sense like that? Or is it actually there? Is it more like a potential, or is it a reality in itself? That's where I'm kind of just a bit lost about it.
Yeah, so there are, of course, different models of how we approach this. I mean, I think there's one view, which is actualism, which says that there are only actually existent things. Now, I think that's actually compatible with what I've said, in the sense that you could say that the soul of the soul, like my essence or part of my essence, even if it isn't present to the world, is in God's mind in some sense, is a divine idea. God knows that complete concept. And because God's ideas are actual things, they're not things like physical things, but they're actual things. It's compatible with actualism. So that's like the worst. Actualism seems to be like the toughest objection to what I've argued, because you might think, well, all that exists are actually existing things and dispositions thereof.
Yeah.
But if theism is true, then divine ideas are actual things, and therefore possibilia, as they're called, they're actual things in God's mind.
So if we go back to the Empedocles quote, if it's like, is that why he says not completely destroyed? Because completely would include destroyed to the divine as well, maybe destroyed in our understanding, but still so reduced to possibility in our understanding, but still in the presence of God and actuality.
Yeah, so I think that's really that's what's so poignant about the Empedocles clips.
Absolutely.
I'm appropriating it. I'm just gonna be honest, I'm appropriating it. But it struck me, that Empedocles, and this resonates, it seems to me, with a lot of the best in Western metaphysics, is that being, if one is a theist, then being is the ground of possibility. Leibniz expound on this deeply. It's one of his arguments for theism, is that there must be a ground of possibility that is. You can't generate possibility of itself. There has to be actuality underneath it. There has to be being underneath it. And so I'm very sympathetic with that. And when I stumbled on it in Empedocles, I found it striking.
Yeah.
And so if that's true, if being is behind, if eternal being is behind all actuality and all possibility, then an annihilation, a destruction, eyes is not necessarily the end.
Yeah, perfectly. Yeah.
Isn't it also, as you say, linked to the model of theism? So unlike a deistic model, say roughly sort of Aristotelian notion of a God as just pure thought, but there's no particular reason why this Aristotelian pure actuality should, in fact, it would be absurd for the Aristotelian God to have any interest in sublunary affairs, human beings, whatever. But once you have this theistic, and particularly in the Christian mode, of a communicative intelligence, right? So the self-diffusive goodness of the divine, then the whole point of the human being, the finite, is communion, is fellowship with its source. Again, throw in the Christian conception that Theos agatheist, the God is love, then that becomes again another theological reinforcement of this model of this theistic model of deity as opposed to a deistic or pantheistic model.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you can approach it from several angles. One, God's love, also a doctrine of creation. This is one of the fascinating ties to the notion of resurrection, because resurrection is a kind of recreation. It's a kind of reiteration of the initial, as it were, loving and powerful creative act, the choice to create some entity that is present to God as a possibility, but is by an act of will brought into being. And so many philosophers have pointed to this, this parallel between resurrection and original creation, as both expressive of kind of profoundly theistic and Christian theistic view of the world.
Now, I know we've been exploiting your generosity this evening, John, but are there any final questions for John? Well, if not, then I think we ought to thank him for an extremely rich and stimulating paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you.